In the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the desert winds carried whispers of both danger and opportunity, a young woman's choice ignited a storm that would forever change the fate of an entire valley. Her rejection of wealth and power in favor of her own path would test the boundaries between two worlds, one of settlers seeking fortune, another of warriors defending their ancestral homeland. What happened in the aftermath would become a testament to courage that transcended the divisions of a fractured frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The copper glow of molten metal cast dancing shadows across the walls of Mason Sullivan's forge as his hammer struck with rhythmic precision. The year was 1876, and while the nation celebrated its centennial in Philadelphia, life in the small settlement of Willow Creek, Arizona Territory continued much as it had for the past decade, a delicate balance of hard work and harder survival. Eleanor Sullivan wiped the sweat from her brow, her calloused hands betraying years of working alongside her father at the anvil. At 22, she possessed a rare combination of beauty and strength that turned heads throughout the valley. Her chestnut hair was typically pulled back in a practical braid, her green eyes reflecting both intelligence and determination. Unlike most women in Willow Creek, Eleanor could shape metal into tools, repair wagon wheels, and ride as well as any man, skills her father had insisted she learn after her mother's death from fever when Eleanor was just 8 years old. "That should hold, Pa," Eleanor said, inspecting the horseshoe she'd just finished. "Mr. Wilson's mare has unusual hooves, but this curve should fit her perfectly." Mason nodded approvingly. "Your eye gets sharper every day, Ellie. I swear you've got the touch your grandfather had. May he rest in peace." He placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, his pride evident despite his reserved nature. The Sullivan Forge had become the lifeblood of Willow Creek over the years. Mason had arrived 15 years earlier with his wife Margaret and young Eleanor, among the first settlers in the valley. Through drought, Apache raids, and the hardships of frontier life, the Sullivan family had persevered, earning the respect of settlers, and eventually a wary acceptance from the local Apache band led by Chief Running Elk, whose territory bordered the growing settlement. An uneasy peace had held for the past 5 years, thanks largely to Mason Sullivan's fair dealings with the Apache. He'd treated their warriors with the same respect he showed his white customers, repairing their weapons and tools without prejudice. In return, Running Elk's band had spared Willow Creek from the raids that plagued other settlements. The jingle of spurs announced a visitor before the tall figure darkened the doorway of the forge. Thomas Blackwood removed his hat as he entered, revealing slicked-back black hair and a clean-shaven face that stood in stark contrast to the dust-covered settlers who typically frequented the Sullivan Forge. "Good afternoon, Mason. Miss Eleanor?" His voice carried the polished tones of Eastern education. "I trust I found you well today." Eleanor stiffened almost imperceptibly. Thomas Blackwood had arrived in Willow Creek 6 months ago, purchasing the largest ranch in the valley and quickly establishing himself as the wealthiest man in the territory. His cattle operation employed half the men in town, and his connections to Eastern investors had brought the promise of the railroad closer than ever before. "Mr. Blackwood," Mason nodded cordially. "What brings you to our humble forge today?" Blackwood's eyes lingered on Eleanor before answering. "The wheel on my carriage has developed a troublesome wobble. I was hoping you might spare the time to examine it." "Eleanor can take a look," Mason replied, glancing at his daughter. "She's got a better eye for carriage wheels than I do these days." Eleanor wiped her hands on her leather apron. "I'll fetch my tools." Outside, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Willow Creek's dusty main street. Blackwood's carriage, an elegant conveyance more suited to Boston than the Arizona Territory, waited. Nearby, its polished wood and brass fittings gleaming. As Eleanor knelt to examine the wheel, Blackwood stood uncomfortably close. "You know, Miss Sullivan, a woman of your intelligence and beauty seems wasted in a blacksmith's forge." Eleanor continued her work without looking up. "Is that so, Mr. Blackwood? And where might I be better suited?" "Perhaps as the mistress of Blackwood Ranch." His voice dropped lower. "I've made no secret of my admiration for you, Eleanor." She rose to her feet, putting distance between them. "And I've made no secret of my contentment with my current situation, Mr. Blackwood." Undeterred, he stepped closer. "Your father won't always be able to run this forge. A woman alone would struggle to maintain such a business in this territory." "I'm stronger than I look," Eleanor replied evenly, though her hands clenched involuntarily. "I don't doubt it. But beauty and strength such as yours deserves a proper setting, like a diamond that needs the right mounting." He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. "I had this brought from San Francisco. Perhaps it might persuade you to reconsider my proposal." Inside the box gleamed a diamond ring, larger than any Eleanor had ever seen. For a moment she simply stared at it, thinking of how its value could probably purchase the entire forge and every tool within it. "It's beautiful," she admitted. Blackwood's face brightened. "Then but my answer remains the same." Eleanor closed the box firmly and handed it back to him. "I appreciate your offer, but I cannot accept it." Blackwood's expression hardened, the charm evaporating from his features. "You're making a grave mistake, Miss Sullivan. A woman in your position should consider practical matters above romantic notions." "There's nothing romantic about my decision, Mr. Blackwood. It's entirely practical. I know who I am and what I want." Eleanor turned back to the wheel. "Your carriage needs a new axle pin. I can have it ready by tomorrow afternoon." "See that you do." All pretense of courtesy had vanished from his voice. He replaced his hat with deliberate slowness. "A word of advice, Miss Sullivan. In this territory, a man's patience has limits, as does his goodwill. Remember that." Eleanor watched him stride. Away, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. Blackwood's growing interest had become the talk of Willow Creek over the past months. Most considered her foolish for not jumping at the opportunity to become the wife of the wealthiest man in the territory. Only her father had supported her decision without question. That evening, as they sat on the small porch of their cabin adjacent to the forge, Eleanor recounted the encounter to her father. "He threatened you?" Mason asked, his voice sharp with concern. "Not in so many words," Eleanor replied, "but his meaning was clear enough." Mason sighed heavily. "Blackwood isn't accustomed to hearing no. Men like him believe everything, and every one has a price." "Well, I don't," Eleanor stated firmly. "Besides, something about him unsettles me. Have you noticed how the Apache never comes near the forge when he's in town? Even Chief Running Elk's son, Swift Arrow, who used to bring their tools for repair, hasn't been seen in months." Mason nodded slowly. "I've wondered about that myself. Blackwood's ranch borders their hunting grounds. There might be trouble brewing we don't know about." A comfortable silence fell between them as the desert sky transformed into a canvas of vivid oranges and purples. Eleanor found herself thinking of Swift Arrow, the young Apache warrior who had once saved her from a rattlesnake while she was gathering herbs 2 summers ago. They had developed an unusual friendship in the years since, never acknowledged publicly, but characterized by mutual respect and the occasional exchange of small gifts. She had taught him some English. He had shown her which desert plants could heal burns from the forge. "Do you ever regret settling here, Pa?" Eleanor asked suddenly. Mason considered the question. "Every place has its hardships, Ellie. Your mother believed we were meant to build something here." His voice softened at the mention of Margaret. "She would be proud of the woman you've become." The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the forge. Samuel Tucker, who ran the general store, appeared at their door just after sunrise, his normally jovial face creased with concern. "Mason, you've got trouble coming," he said without preamble. "Blackwood was drinking heavily at the saloon last night, telling anyone who'd listen that you and Eleanor had insulted him. He's hired 3 new men, rough sorts from down Tucson way. They rode in yesterday." Mason's expression remained impassive, but Eleanor noticed how his hand moved automatically to the rifle mounted above the door. "Appreciate the warning, Sam. Anything else we should know?" Tucker shifted uncomfortably. "There's talk that Blackwood's been having private meetings with Captain Brooks from Fort Whipple. Some say he's trying to convince the army that the local Apache are responsible for his missing cattle." Eleanor exchanged a glance with her father. Captain Brooks was known for his harsh views regarding the native tribes. "That's nonsense," Mason said flatly. "Running Elk's people have kept to the peace treaty. If Blackwood's losing cattle, he should look to natural causes or his own incompetent ranch hands." After Tucker left, Eleanor and Mason went about their day with heightened awareness. By mid-afternoon, Blackwood's carriage wheel was repaired, but the man himself never appeared to retrieve it. Instead, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Eleanor noticed a plume of dust rising from the direction of Blackwood Ranch. Riders. "Coming," she called to her father, who was finishing work on a plow blade. Mason stepped outside, shading his eyes against the setting sun. 5 of them, and riding hard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor recognized Blackwood's tall figure leading 4 rough-looking men, their expressions visible even at a distance. None of them wore the friendly faces of neighbors. "Get inside," Mason told her quietly, "and bring my pistol." Eleanor complied swiftly, returning with the Colt revolver her father kept locked in a box beneath his bed. By then, the riders had reached their yard, horses lathered from hard riding. "Sullivan!" Blackwood's voice carried a dangerous edge. "I want a word with you and your disrespectful daughter." Mason stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and the forge entrance where Eleanor stood. "You've had plenty of words, Blackwood. If you've come for your carriage wheel, it's ready. That'll be $3. Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "I'm not here for a wheel. I'm here to teach you a lesson about the natural order of things. In this territory, there's no lesson needed here," Mason replied evenly. "We've done honest work for honest pay, same as always." Blackwood dismounted, and his men followed suit. "You see, that's where you're wrong, Sullivan. There's a new order coming to this valley. The railroad will reach us within a year. Easton, money is flowing in. Men like you, blacksmiths and small-time farmers, are relics of a passing age." "Is that why you're trying to stir up trouble with the Apache?" Mason asked. "To clear them out before your investors arrive?" A flash of surprise crossed Blackwood's face before his mask of contempt returned. "The savages are impeding progress. They'll be moved to the reservation where they belong, one way or another." "Those savages have as much right to their land as you do to yours," Eleanor spoke up, stepping forward despite her father's warning glance. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as they fell on her. "Still fiery, I see. Such a spirit would serve you better as my wife than as an old maid playing at being a blacksmith." "I'd rather be an old maid than the wife of a man without honor," Eleanor replied coldly. One of Blackwood's men snickered and his face darkened with rage. "Enough! Sullivan, you and your daughter have until sunrise to clear out of Willow Creek. After that, I can't be responsible for what happens." Mason's hand tightened on his revolver. "This is our home. We're not leaving." "Then you've made your choice." Blackwood nodded to his men, who spread out menacingly. "Burns, Delaney, search the forge and cabin. Take anything of value. You have no right." Eleanor stepped forward, but her father held her back. "They're armed, Ellie," he muttered. "We're outnumbered." The next moments unfolded in a blur of violence and destruction. Blackwood's men ransacked the cabin, tossing furniture and breaking what couldn't be carried. Mason and Eleanor were forced to watch helplessly as two men emerged from the forge, carrying their precious tools, implements that represented years of investment and craftsmanship. "Stop this madness, Blackwood," Mason pleaded. "Those tools are our livelihood." Blackwood examined a finely crafted hammer, testing its weight in his hand. "Was your livelihood, Sullivan? Consider this your eviction notice." He turned to his men. "Burn it, all of it." Eleanor lunged forward with a cry of protest, but one of the men caught her arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. "Let her go!" Mason raised his pistol, but before he could fire, another of Blackwood's men struck him from behind. The aging blacksmith crumpled to the ground. "Pah!" Eleanor struggled against her captor as her father lay motionless in the dirt. Blackwood stepped closer, grabbing Eleanor's chin roughly. "This could have been avoided. Remember that while you watch everything you love turn to ash." One of the men emerged from the cabin with a lamp, smashing it against the wooden wall. The kerosene ignited immediately, flames licking up the dry timber with frightening speed. Another man did the same to the forge, setting fire to the workshop. That had been the center of the Sullivans' lives for 15 years. Forced to her knees beside her unconscious father, Eleanor could only watch in horror as their home and livelihood blazed against the darkening sky. Tears streamed down her face, but she refused to beg. "When your father wakes, if he wakes, tell him this is the price of defiance," Blackwood said coldly. "And my offer is rescinded. No man wants damaged goods." He mounted his horse, signaling his men to do the same. The man holding Eleanor shoved her roughly to the ground before joining them. "Enjoy the warmth of your principles tonight, Miss Sullivan," Blackwood called over his shoulder as they rode away. "The desert gets cold after sunset." Left alone with her injured father and their burning home, Eleanor fought through her shock to drag Mason away from the growing inferno. The heat seared her skin as she pulled him to safety near the water trough. His breathing was steady, but blood trickled from a gash on his temple. "Pa, wake up!" she pleaded, tearing a strip from her skirt to bind his wound. "Please, Pa." As darkness fell completely, the fire reached its peak, illuminating the area with a terrible brightness. Eleanor knew that even if someone from town noticed, they would arrive too late to save anything. Everything they owned, tools, clothes, the small box containing her mother's wedding ring, all of it would be consumed by Blackwood's vengeful flames. A sound behind her made Eleanor whirl around, reaching for her father's fallen pistol. She raised it with shaking hands, expecting to see Blackwood or his men returning. Instead, she found herself aiming at Swift Arrow, the Apache warrior motionless at the edge of the firelight, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the destruction before him. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the divide of their two worlds, worlds that had just been violently upended by forces beyond their control. "Help us," Eleanor whispered, lowering the gun. "Please." Swift Arrow's dark eyes reflected the dancing flames as he stepped forward, the first of many shadows emerging silently from the desert night. Swift Arrow knelt beside Mason Sullivan, his movements precise and deliberate as he examined the wound on the blacksmith's head. Behind him, 5 other Apache warriors maintained a watchful perimeter around what remained of the Sullivan homestead. The crackling flames cast strange, dancing shadows across their painted faces. "He lives," Swift Arrow said in careful English, meeting Eleanor's anxious gaze. Headstrong like an anvil, relief washed over Eleanor's face. "Thank you for coming. How did you know?" Swift Arrow gestured toward the mountains. "We watch, always watch Blackwood men. See fire. Come quick." One of the other warriors approached, speaking rapidly in Apache. Though Eleanor had picked up a few words over the years, she couldn't follow their conversation. Swift Arrow nodded gravely before turning back to her. Nighthawk says Blackwood men ride to town, tell lies, say Apache burned Sullivan home. His dark eyes reflected both anger and concern. Bad trouble coming. Eleanor's mind raced. If Blackwood convinced the townspeople that the Apache were responsible for the attack, it would shatter the fragile peace that had held for the past 5 years. It might even bring soldiers from Fort Whipple, soldiers all too eager to have an excuse to move against Running Elk's people. "We need to get my father somewhere safe," she said, trying to think clearly despite her exhaustion and shock. "And then I must go to town, tell the truth before Blackwood's lies take root." Swift Arrow shook his head. "Town not safe for you now. Blackwood men there." "Then where?" Eleanor's voice betrayed her desperation. The night was growing colder, and her father needed shelter and proper medical attention. Swift Arrow exchanged looks with his companions before making a decision. "You come with us. To our camp. Old medicine woman helps Sullivan. You stay until the sun comes again." Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have hesitated. White settlers simply did not enter Apache encampments, especially women alone. But as she looked at her unconscious father and the smoldering ruins of everything they had built, she realized they had no choice. "Yes," she agreed. "Thank you." 2. Warriors fashioned a travois from branches salvaged from the edge of the property, securing Mason to it with surprising gentleness. As they prepared to depart, Eleanor made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the ruins. Despite Swift Arrow's warnings about the danger, she darted toward a section of the cabin where the fire had begun to die down. "Eleanor," Swift Arrow called after her, but she ignored him, pulling her shawl over her face against the smoke. The heat was still intense, but through watering eyes, she spotted what she was looking for, the small metal box that had somehow survived the initial collapse of the cabin wall. Dodging falling embers, she snatched it up, crying out as the hot metal seared her palms. Swift Arrow was at her side in an instant, pulling her back as a beam crashed down where she had stood seconds before. "Foolish," he admonished, but his expression softened when he saw her clutching the box to her chest despite her burned hands. "My mother's ring," she explained, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. "All I have left of her." Nodded once in understanding, then guided her away from the ruins. One of the other warriors offered her a water skin, which she used to cool her burned hands before taking a grateful drink. The journey to the Apache camp took nearly 2 hours, following hidden trails that wound through ravines and dense mesquite thickets. Mason remained unconscious, but his breathing stayed steady. Eleanor walked alongside the travois, occasionally murmuring reassurances to her father, though she wasn't sure he could hear. Swift Arrow led the way, moving with the confidence of someone traveling a familiar path, even in darkness. Occasionally he would stop, listening intently before signaling the others to continue. Eleanor realized he was ensuring they weren't being followed. "Blackwood looks for Apache to blame," he explained during one such pause. "We must be careful." Finally, they created a small rise, revealing a hidden valley nestled against the base of the mountains. Campfires glowed in the distance, marking the location of the Apache encampment. As they approached, Eleanor felt a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. Few white settlers had ever seen this place. Fewer still had been invited in as guests rather than captives. Their arrival caused immediate stir. Women emerged from wickiups, children were hurried inside, and warriors gathered with weapons ready. Swift Arrow raised his hand in a gesture of peace, calling out in his native tongue. Gradually, the tension eased, though suspicious eyes continued. To track Eleanor's movements, an older man stepped forward, Chief Running Elk himself, his face deeply lined from years in the harsh desert sun, his bearing still proud despite his advanced age. Swift Arrow addressed him respectfully, explaining the situation in their language while gesturing to Mason's unconscious form and then to Eleanor. Running Elk's penetrating gaze settled on Eleanor. "Your father is an honest man," he said in surprisingly good English, not like other white eyes. "Thank you for helping us, Chief Running Elk," Eleanor replied, summoning what dignity she could despite her disheveled appearance. "We've lost everything." "Not everything," the chief corrected. "You have life, you have truth." He turned to a small group of women who had gathered nearby. "Take Sullivan to Medicine Woman. Take his daughter also." Mason was carried to a large wickiup on the edge of the camp, where an elderly woman waited. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her hands gnarled like desert mesquite, but her movements were surprisingly nimble as she directed the warriors to place Mason on a bed of soft hides. "I am White Dove," she said to Eleanor in halting English. "I will help your father." For the next hour, Eleanor watched as White Dove cleaned and dressed Mason's head wound, applying a poultice of crushed herbs that filled the wickiup with a sharp, medicinal scent. The old woman also examined Eleanor's burned hands, coating them with a cooling salve before wrapping them in strips of soft buckskin. "You rest now," White Dove instructed when she had finished. "Father needs sleep, you too," though exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. Eleanor found sleep elusive. She sat beside her father, the events of the day replaying in her mind. How quickly everything had changed. Just that morning, she had awakened in her own bed in the cabin that had been her home for 15 years. Now she was in an Apache camp, her father wounded, their livelihood destroyed, and a powerful enemy spreading lies that might ignite violence against the very people who had offered them shelter. Dawn was breaking when Swift Arrow appeared at the entrance of the wickiup. "You come," he said simply. "Chief wishes to speak." Outside, the camp was already active. Women tended fires, children carried water, and warriors prepared for the day's hunting. Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares as she followed Swift Arrow to a larger wickiup, where Running Elk sat with several elder warriors. The chief gestured for her to sit. "Blackwood men rode through the night," he said without preamble. "Reached, fought Whipple before the sun rose. Told soldiers Apache burned Sullivan Forge, took Sullivan daughter." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "That's a lie." Running Elk nodded gravely. "White soldiers believe white men's words, not the Apache truth." "Soldiers. And come soon," added another elder. "With guns." The implications were clear. By harboring Eleanor and her father, the Apache were placing themselves in direct danger, yet they had chosen to help despite the risk. "I need to go to town," Eleanor said firmly. "Tell the truth before this escalated further." Running Elk shook his head. "Town not safe, Blackwood men there." "Then I'll go to Fort Whipple," she insisted. "Speak directly to Captain Brooks." Swift Arrow, who had been standing silently nearby, stepped forward. "I take her, through back trails. No one sees." The elders erupted in discussion, clearly disapproving of the suggestion. Swift Arrow argued passionately, occasionally gesturing toward Eleanor. Finally, Running Elk raised a hand for silence. "Decision is made. Swift Arrow will take you close to the fort, but not to gates. Too dangerous for him." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I won't forget this kindness." "Before you go," Running Elk continued, "you must know the full truth about Blackwood." He proceeded to reveal what the Apache had observed over recent months. Blackwood's men had been systematically encroaching on Apache hunting grounds, intimidating isolated bands, and destroying winter food caches. More disturbing still, they had begun damming a creek that was vital to the tribe's water supply. "Blackwood wants war," Running Elk explained. "War brings soldiers. Soldiers move Apache to reservation. Land becomes empty. Railroad comes. Blackwood gets rich." The calculated cruelty of the plan left Eleanor speechless. Blackwood wasn't just a spurned suitor lashing out in anger. He was orchestrating a campaign to dispossess an entire people of their ancestral lands. "You believe me?" Running Elk asked, studying her face. "Yes," Eleanor replied without hesitation, "and I'll make sure Captain Brooks hears the truth." After checking on her father, who had regained consciousness but remained weak, Eleanor prepared to leave with Swift Arrow. White Dove provided her with fresh water and pemmican for the journey, while another woman offered a deerskin tunic to replace Eleanor's soot-stained clothing. Mason gripped his daughter's hand as she said goodbye. "Be careful, Ellie. Blackwood won't take kindly to being exposed." "I'll be back soon, Pa. Rest and recover your strength." She pressed a kiss to his forehead, trying to project more confidence than she felt. Swift Arrow was waiting with 2 horses when she emerged. "We rode fast," he said, helping her mount. "Stay off main trails." They set out just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, following game paths that wound through terrain too rough for cavalry patrols. Swift Arrow rose slightly ahead, constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of danger. Around midday, they paused in a sheltered arroyo to rest the horses. As Eleanor drank from her water skin, Swift Arrow suddenly tensed, motioning for silence. A moment later, she heard it too, the distant thunder of hoofbeats. "Soldiers!" Swift Arrow whispered, leading her deeper into the shadows of the arroyo's overhanging wall. From their hiding place, they watched as a cavalry patrol passed along the ridge above them. 12 soldiers led by none other than Captain Brooks himself. Beside the captain rode Thomas Blackwood, pointing ahead toward the mountains where the Apache camp lay. "They seek our camp," Swift Arrow said grimly, once the patrol had passed. "We must warn my people." Eleanor faced an impossible choice. Continue to Fort Whipple as planned, hoping to find someone who would listen in the captain's absence, or return. To warn the Apache of the approaching danger, we go back, she decided. We can try for the fort tomorrow. Swift Arrow's expression showed approval. "You have a good heart, Eleanor Sullivan." They rode hard, taking an even more circuitous route to avoid detection. The sun was low in the western sky when they finally spotted smoke rising from a distant ridge. Too much smoke for normal cooking fires. "No!" Swift Arrow spurred his horse forward, Eleanor following close behind. They created a rise overlooking the hidden valley to find the Apache camp in chaos. Soldiers surrounded the perimeter, while women and children fled toward the shelter of the mountains. Warriors fought a desperate holding action, buying time for the most vulnerable to escape. In the center of it all stood Thomas Blackwood, watching with cold satisfaction as a wickiup burst into flames. "We're too late," Eleanor whispered in horror. Swift Arrow's face hardened with rage. He reached for his bow, but Eleanor caught his arm. "No! They'll kill you. We need another way." Below them, soldiers were herding captured Apache women and children into a group. Among them, Eleanor spotted White Dove, supporting an elder who had fallen. Of Running Elk, there was no sign. Either he had escaped or was among the bodies scattered. Across the camp, my father, Eleanor suddenly remembered. He was too weak to flee. Swift Arrow pointed toward a cluster of soldiers near what had been the medicine wickiup. Between them stood Mason Sullivan, upright but swaying, his bandaged head marking him clearly. Captain Brooks approached him, gesturing angrily. Though they couldn't hear the exchange, it was clear the captain was demanding answers. "I need to get down there," Eleanor said. Swift Arrow shook his head. "Too dangerous. They have my father, and they're attacking your people based on lies." Her eyes flashed with determination. "I won't hide while innocent blood is shed." Before he could stop her, Eleanor urged her horse down the slope, riding directly toward the soldiers. She heard Swift Arrow call after her, but she didn't look. "Back! Captain Brooks!" she shouted as she approached. "Captain Brooks, stop this at once!" All eyes turned toward her as she reined in her horse at the edge of the camp. Soldiers raised their rifles uncertainly until the captain signaled them to hold fire. "Miss Sullivan?" Brooks stared in disbelief. You're alive. No thanks to him. Eleanor pointed directly at Blackwood, whose face had drained of color at her appearance. He's the one who burned our home and nearly killed my father, not the Apache. They saved us. Murmurs ran through the assembled soldiers. Blackwood stepped forward, quickly regaining his composure. She's clearly confused, Captain, suffering from shock after her ordeal. His voice oozed false concern. The savages have obviously intimidated her. I'm not confused. Eleanor dismounted, walking directly up to Brooks. Thomas Blackwood proposed marriage to me. I refused. He threatened me, then attacked our forge with his men. They stole our tools, burned our home, and left my father for dead. Brooks looked between Eleanor and Blackwood, uncertainty creeping into his expression. Blackwood told us the Apache raided your home, said they took you captive. He lied, and I can prove it. Eleanor turned to the assembled soldiers. Many of you know my father, know our forge. Have we ever spoken falsely to any of you? Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. One sergeant stepped forward. The Sullivan Forge fixed my saber last winter, Captain. Didn't charge me extra despite the difficult work. They're good people. Mason Sullivan straightened as much as his injuries allowed. Thomas Blackwood wants the Apache removed, so the railroad will pay top dollar for his land. He's been provoking them for months, hoping for an incident he could use. Preposterous, Blackwood sputtered. Captain, we're wasting time with these accusations while hostiles escape into the mountains. They're only hostile because you attacked their camp without provocation, Eleanor countered. She turned back to Brooks. Captain, if the Apache had truly attacked us, why would my father be wearing their medicine? Why would I be wearing their clothing? They took us in, cared for us. Brooks studied her carefully, then looked at Mason's bandaged head with its distinctive pattern of Apache healing herbs. Doubt was clearly taking root. Sergeant Miller, he called, take Mr. Blackwood into custody pending further investigation. What? Blackwood's face contorted with rage. This is outrageous. I'm the largest landowner in the territory. You can't believe this blacksmith's daughter over me. Actually, I can, Brooks replied coolly. Especially when 3 of my scouts reported unusual activity at your ranch last night. Activity that aligns more with Miss Sullivan's account than yours. As soldiers moved to restrain Blackwood, he made a desperate lunge toward Eleanor, drawing a hidden pistol from beneath his coat. You ruined everything, you stubborn bitch. The shot rang out a split second later, but it wasn't from Blackwood's gun. The rancher crumpled to the ground, blood blooming across his chest from the arrow that had struck with unerring accuracy. All eyes turned toward the ridge where Swift Arrow stood, bow still raised, his silhouette stark against the setting sun. For one tense moment, it seemed the soldiers might open fire. Then Captain Brooks raised his hand. Hold your fire. That man just saved Miss Sullivan's life. In the uncertain peace that followed, Eleanor found herself standing between 2 worlds, the settler's world she had always known, and the Apache world that had shown her kindness when she needed it most. As White Dove approached to check on Mason's bandages, as Captain Brooks ordered his men to release the Apache captives, as Swift Arrow descended cautiously from the ridge, Eleanor realized that something momentous had shifted in the valley. Blackwood's scheme had failed, but his actions had forced an unexpected meeting of worlds that might never have occurred otherwise. As she watched White Dove and the army doctor confer over her father's care, Eleanor wondered if perhaps, from the ashes of destruction, something new and better might rise. Thomas Blackwood did not die. The arrow Swift Arrow had loosed with such precision had struck just below the collarbone, missing vital organs but causing enough blood loss to render the rancher unconscious. As the sun set over the smoldering Apache camp, army medics worked to stabilize him for transport back to Fort Whipple. Captain Brooks supervised the effort with a grim expression. He'll stand trial for what he's done, he told Eleanor. Arson, attempted murder, filing false reports to military personnel. The territorial judge will ensure he faces justice. Eleanor watched as Blackwood was loaded onto a makeshift stretcher. Justice won't rebuild our forge or restore what the Apache have lost today. No, Brooks admitted, but it's a start. He hesitated, then added, I owe you an apology, Miss Sullivan. I should have verified Blackwood's claims before mobilizing. My men, you believed what you expected to hear, Captain. Eleanor's voice held no accusation, just weary understanding. We all do sometimes. Brooks nodded solemnly before turning to address the situation at hand. With Blackwood's deception exposed, the captain ordered an immediate cessation of hostilities. Against the Apache, soldiers who had been pursuing fleeing tribe members were recalled, and those captured were released. Swift Arrow had descended from the ridge, joining Eleanor and her father. The young warrior kept a wary distance from the soldiers, his hand never straying far from his knife, despite the apparent truce. What happens now? Eleanor asked, looking between Swift Arrow and Captain Brooks. Now we rebuild, answered a familiar. A voiced Chief Running Elk emerged from a group of returning Apache, supported by two younger warriors. The elderly chief had suffered a bullet graze to his leg during the initial attack, but had managed to lead many of his people to safety in the mountains. My people will return to this place, he continued, surveying the damage with stoic dignity. We have survived worse than this. Captain Brooks stepped forward cautiously. Chief Running Elk, I deeply regret the actions taken today based on false information. Fort Whipple will provide compensation for the damage. Running Elk regarded the captain with measured skepticism. Words are easy, Captain. Actions will tell the truth. I understand. Brooks turned to his sergeant. Miller, organize men to help salvage what can be saved here, and send a rider to bring wagons with supplies, food, blankets, medicine. As soldiers and Apache cautiously began working together to extinguish remaining fires and treat the wounded, Mason Sullivan approached his daughter. Though still weak from his injury, the blacksmith stood straighter now, determination evident in his bearing. We've lost our home, Ellie, but not our skills, he said, clasping her shoulder. We can rebuild the forge. Eleanor nodded, though uncertainty clouded her features. With what, Pa? Our tools are gone, our savings. Not all is lost, Swift Arrow interjected. To their surprise, he produced a small bundle wrapped in hide. I find these in ashes before we leave. Inside were several of Mason's smaller, specialized tools, the ones Eleanor had meticulously crafted herself over the years. Though scorched and smoke-damaged, they remained serviceable. Swift Arrow, Eleanor breathed, touched by his foresight. Thank you. The young warrior nodded solemnly. Small things, but important, like seeds for new growth. As twilight deepened into night, a strange camaraderie developed among the disparate groups at the camp. Soldiers who hours before had been firing at Apache warriors now shared coffee with them around campfires. White Dove moved among the wounded of both sides, administering her healing remedies alongside the army doctor, who watched her techniques with undisguised fascination. Eleanor found herself translating between Apache women and soldiers, her limited knowledge of the native language supplemented by Swift Arrow's guidance. By midnight, an uneasy peace had settled over the camp. Temporary shelters had been erected, the wounded were stabilized, and sentries, both Apache and military, maintained a vigilant watch for trouble. Near one of the central fires, Captain Brooks, Chief Running Elk, and Mason Sullivan engaged in serious conversation, their faces illuminated by flickering flames. What are they discussing? Eleanor asked Swift Arrow as they distributed blankets to children and elders. Future, he replied simply, how to live together when trust is broken. Eleanor paused, watching the three men, representatives of such different worlds, leaning toward each other in earnest dialogue. Can it be done? Swift Arrow considered her question carefully. Hard path, many thorns, but only the path forward. Dawn arrived with the promised wagons from Fort Whipple, bringing not only supplies, but also news that had spread rapidly through the territory. Settlers from Willow Creek accompanied the wagons, coming to see for themselves the truth about the Sullivans and the Apache. Samuel Tucker, the general store owner who had warned them about Blackwood's intentions, was among the first to approach Eleanor. "Word's all over the valley about what Blackwood did," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Most folks never liked him much, but nobody thought he'd go this far." "What happens to his ranch now?" Eleanor asked. "That's what everyone's wondering. He owes money to half the businesses in town, and with him facing prison—" Tucker shrugged. "Banks will probably claim it, unless he has family back east." Throughout the morning, more settlers arrived, farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, many bringing donations for both the Sullivans and the Apache. Eleanor was struck by how many faces she recognized, people who had frequented her father's forge over the years, but had never before set foot in Apache territory. By midday, Captain Brooks called for attention. Standing beside Chief Running Elk and Mason Sullivan, he addressed the gathered crowd. "What happened here was a grave injustice," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly. "But from tragedy can come opportunity. Chief Running Elk, Mr. Sullivan and I have been discussing how to ensure such deception never again leads to bloodshed between our peoples." Running Elk stepped forward, his weathered face solemn. "For many seasons, my people have watched white settlers come to this valley. Some, like Sullivan, trade fairly. Others, like Blackwood, bring only greed and lies." He gestured toward the mountains. "These lands have been Apache home since before your grandfathers were born. We do not wish to fight, but we cannot leave." Mason Sullivan spoke next. "My daughter and I owe our lives to Swift Arrow and Chief Running Elk's people. When Blackwood destroyed everything we had, it was the Apache who offered shelter and healing. That's something I won't forget." Captain Brooks nodded. "Therefore, with the authority granted me by the territorial governor, I am proposing the establishment of a new trading post on this site, one operated jointly by settlers and Apache." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Brooks continued. "This post will serve as neutral ground where disputes can be resolved peacefully. Fair trade can flourish, and mutual understanding can grow." He turned to Mason. "Mr. Sullivan has agreed to rebuild his forge here to serve both communities." Eleanor stared at her father in astonishment. This was the first she'd heard of such a plan. Mason caught her eye and smiled slightly. "It was your idea, Ellie. Remember? You always said my forge could be a bridge between worlds." It was true, though Eleanor had never imagined it manifesting in quite this way. For years, she had encouraged her father to learn Apache words, to respect their customs when they brought items for repair, to treat them as valued customers rather than suspicious outsiders. "What about Blackwood's men?" someone called from the crowd. "They're still out there. 3 were apprehended trying to flee the territory," Brooks replied. "The others will face justice or leave. Without Blackwood's money and protection, they pose little threat." As the discussion continued, Swift Arrow approached Eleanor, who stood somewhat apart from the crowd, processing the rapidly unfolding events. "Your father is a wise man," he said. "Sees paths others miss." Eleanor nodded slowly. "It's a bold vision, but will your people accept it? Will mine?" Swift Arrow's gaze swept over the gathering, where Apache and settlers now mingled cautiously. "Change comes like spring flood, cannot stop, can only guide." The next week passed in a blur of activity, with soldiers providing protection and settlers contributing labor. The rebuilding began in earnest. The trading post took shape near the center of what had been the Apache camp, with the new forge attached to its eastern side. Mason Sullivan directed the construction with surprising vigor, his head wound, healing quickly under White Dove's continued care. Eleanor found herself working alongside Apache women, learning their techniques for constructing wiki-ups that could withstand the harsh desert conditions. Swift Arrow often served as intermediary, his knowledge of both worlds proving invaluable. As cultural misunderstandings inevitably arose, Eleanor noticed how naturally leadership came to the young warrior, how others, both Apache and settler, increasingly sought his counsel. "You should be proud," she told him one evening as they sorted through salvaged metal for the forge. "You're building something important here." Swift Arrow paused, running his hand over a twisted piece of iron. "I learn from watching you, Eleanor Sullivan. You bend but do not break, like good metal on fire." His words brought unexpected warmth to her cheeks. Their friendship had deepened through shared adversity, evolving into something neither had anticipated. Though neither spoke of it openly, others had begun to notice the connection between them, evidenced by knowing glances from White Dove and occasional worried frowns from Mason. 10 days after Blackwood's attack, a military courier arrived with official documents from the territorial governor. Captain Brooks called a meeting at the half-completed trading post to share the news. "The governor has approved our proposal," he announced to the assembled group. "The land between Willow Creek and the foothills, including what was Blackwood Ranch, is now designated as a cooperative zone under joint stewardship of Fort Whipple, the town council, and the Apache Tribal Council." Running Elk received the proclamation with dignified satisfaction. "A good beginning. Now we see if words become truth." "There's more," Brooks continued. "Thomas Blackwood succumbed to his wounds yesterday at Fort Whipple. Before he died, he signed a confession detailing his scheme to provoke war with the Apache, and for financial gain." A somber silence fell over the gathering. Though few mourned Blackwood himself, the news served as a stark reminder of how easily peace could be shattered by one man's greed. "What happens to his land now?" Samuel Tucker asked, voicing the question on many minds. "According to territorial law, with no heirs present, his assets will be auctioned to settle debts," Brooks explained. "However, the governor has authorized me to set aside a portion of those proceeds to compensate both the Sullivan family and the Apache tribe for damages suffered." That evening, as a fiery sunset painted the western sky, Eleanor sat on a rocky outcropping overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, she could see the trading post taking shape, the scattered wiki-ups of the Apache who had chosen to remain, and the trail leading back to Willow Creek, where some settlers were returning with news of the day's developments. "May I join you?" Swift Arrow's voice came from behind her. Eleanor smiled. "Of course." He settled beside her, his presence a now familiar comfort. For a time, they sat in companionable silence, watching as stars began to appear in the deepening blue. "Above, my father says the forge will be operational again within 2 weeks," Eleanor said eventually. "Captain Brooks found anvils at Fort Whipple's blacksmith shop that we can use until we can afford to order new ones." Swift Arrow nodded. "Good news. Many need your skills." "And yours," Eleanor added. "I've seen how you've helped everyone adapt to working together. Even the soldiers respect you now." The young warrior looked down, uncharacteristically humble. "I only show the path that was already there, waiting." Eleanor turned to study his profile against the twilight sky. "What will you do now, Swift Arrow? Return to the mountains with those who left?" He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "My place is here, where 2 rivers join to make stronger currents." The metaphor wasn't lost on Eleanor. Like 2 streams converging, their different worlds were creating something new, something potentially powerful. "There will be challenges," she said softly. "Not everyone will accept what's happening here." "Yes," he agreed. "Some Apache believe we compromise too much. Some white settlers think the same. Both fear what they do not understand. And you? What do you fear? Swift Arrow considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had increasingly drawn Eleanor to him. I fear forgetting. Why we fight to survive, not just to live, but to live with meaning. His answer resonated deeply with Eleanor. In the chaos following Blackwood's attack, she had focused entirely on immediate needs, safety, shelter, rebuilding. But Swift Arrow's words reminded her that survival alone wasn't enough. When I was little, she said, before we came to this, in Valley, my mother used to tell me that home isn't a place. It's where you can be true to yourself while supporting others to do the same. Swift Arrow smiled. Your mother was a wise woman. She would have liked you, Eleanor replied, surprised by how certain she felt about this. As darkness fully claimed the sky, torches were lit around the trading post below, creating a constellation of earthbound stars. The sight stirred something in Eleanor, a vision of what might be possible if they could maintain the fragile peace that had emerged from destruction. My father worries, she said after a moment. About us? Swift Arrow asked directly. Eleanor nodded. He supports the trading post, respects your people, but... She hesitated. Some differences seem harder to bridge than others. Elders on both sides will question, Swift Arrow acknowledged. This path has not walked before. Does that concern you? He turned fully toward her. Eleanor Sullivan, you taught me English words, shared your knowledge of metal and fire. I showed you desert plants, ways of my people. We learn from each other. Grow stronger together. His dark eyes held hers steadily. Why should the heart be different? The simplicity of his logic disarmed her. Before she could respond, voices called from below. They were needed to help unload a late-arriving wagon of supplies. As they descended toward the flickering torchlight, Eleanor felt a certainty settling within her. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance, setbacks, perhaps even dangers they couldn't yet imagine. But something profound had been sparked in the aftermath of violence. Something worth protecting and nurturing. 3 months later, the trading post and Sullivan Forge celebrated their official opening. The governor himself attended, along with representatives from surrounding settlements and Apache bands that had initially been skeptical of the arrangement. The forge gleamed with new equipment, much of it purchased with the compensation from Blackwood's estate. Mason Sullivan, now fully recovered, demonstrated techniques for shaping metal while Eleanor translated his explanations for Apache observers. Nearby, White Dove held an impromptu clinic showing settlers how to use desert plants for common ailments, while the Fort Whipple doctor took careful notes. Captain Brooks, recently promoted to Major for his role in establishing the cooperative zone, stood with Chief Running Elk, surveying the gathering. Did you ever imagine this was possible? Brooks asked the elderly chief. Running Elk's eyes crinkled at the corners. Old men dream, young ones build. Both are necessary. His gaze shifted to where Eleanor and Swift Arrow moved among the visitors, their easy partnership evident in how they anticipated each other's needs without speaking. The young Apache warrior wore a unique blend of traditional garments and settler clothing, symbolizing his role as bridge between cultures. Eleanor had incorporated Apache designs into her leatherwork apron, her skill with metal now complemented by techniques learned from tribal craftswomen. Later that evening, as celebrations continued around multiple campfires, Mason sought out his daughter. Your mother would be proud, Ellie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This place, what you've helped create here, it's beyond anything I could have imagined. Eleanor leaned against her father's shoulder. Sometimes destruction clears the way for something better to grow. Mason nodded thoughtfully. Swift Arrow. I said something similar yesterday. He's a good man. Different from what I expected for you, but a good man nonetheless. Eleanor looked up in surprise. Her father chuckled at her expression. "I'm old, daughter, not blind. I've seen how you look at each other." He sighed. "It won't be an easy path, but then nothing worthwhile ever is." As if summoned by their conversation, Swift Arrow approached, carrying a small object wrapped in soft leather for you, he said, offering the package to Eleanor. "From all of us." Inside was a medallion of exquisitely worked silver, Apache symbols entwined with the tools of a blacksmith. It hung from a band of leather adorned with tiny turquoise beads. "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, recognizing the blend of techniques. Apache, silverwork combined with methods she had taught several tribal craftsmen. "It represents you," Swift Arrow explained, "woman who stands between worlds and makes them stronger." Mason cleared his throat. "I'll leave you two to talk," he said, with a knowing nod to Swift Arrow before walking toward a nearby fire where Samuel Tucker was sharing a story with enthralled listeners. Alone in the gathering dusk, Eleanor and Swift Arrow stood at the threshold of possibility, their unlikely alliance forged in fire and tempered by shared purpose. Behind them lay the ruins of what had been. Before them stretched a future neither could fully envision, but both were committed to building. "In your language," Swift Arrow said softly, taking her hand. "What is the word for when two rivers join and cannot be separated again?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "Confluence." "Confluence," he repeated carefully. "Good word. Strong words." As the stars emerged above and the fires burned below, Eleanor Sullivan, daughter of a blacksmith, bridge between cultures, architect of a new beginning, realized that sometimes the most powerful transformations arise not from holding tightly to what is, but from the courage to forge what might be. The seasons turned, and with them the landscape of the valley transformed. 1 year after the establishment of the trading post, what had begun as a tentative experiment in cooperation had blossomed into a thriving community unlike any other in the Arizona Territory. Winter gave way to spring, bringing fresh growth to land scarred by fire. The trading post, now expanded to include storerooms, meeting spaces, and guest quarters, stood as a monument to persistence. Its walls, built from local stone by Apache hands guided by settler knowledge, had weathered their first desert winter. Admirably, Eleanor Sullivan moved purposefully through the forge, now twice the size of the one Blackwood had destroyed. Apprentices from both cultures followed her lead, their faces intent as she demonstrated the delicate art of tempering a knife blade. At 23, Eleanor had grown into her role not just as a blacksmith, but as a teacher and mediator between worlds. "Remember," she instructed, lifting the glowing metal from the coals, "too much heat weakens the steel, too little leaves it brittle. The secret lies in finding the perfect balance." Among her students stood Lily Hawkins, daughter of a rancher who had initially opposed the cooperative zone. The 16-year-old watched with undisguised admiration as Eleanor manipulated the metal with expert precision. "How did you learn all this?" Lily asked after the demonstration concluded. Eleanor smiled, memories of her father's patient teaching flooding back. "One mistake at a time, and by listening to those who knew more than I did," Mason Sullivan observed from the doorway, pride evident in his weathered features. Though he still oversaw the forge's operations, he had gradually ceded day-to-day responsibilities to Eleanor. His head injury had left lingering effects, occasional headaches, moments of disorientation, that made the intense heat of the forge difficult to endure for extended periods. "You've got a gift for teaching," he told Eleanor as the apprentices dispersed to practice their new skills. "Your mother had that same patience." Eleanor wiped sweat from her brow with a cloth. "I've had good examples." Before Mason could respond, the trading post bell rang out. 3 short peals, followed by 2 long ones. The signal for the council meeting. "That's earlier than expected," Mason frowned. "Brooks wasn't due until this afternoon." Something must have happened, Eleanor replied, already removing her heavy leather apron. They made their way to the central meeting hall, a circular structure that blended Apache wiki-up design with settler construction techniques. Its high domed ceiling allowed air to circulate, keeping the interior cool even in the punishing desert heat. Inside, members of both communities were gathering. Chief Running Elk and the Apache Tribal Council occupied one side of the room, while Samuel Tucker and other representatives from Willow Creek took their places opposite. Swift Arrow stood at the center, deep in conversation with a dust-covered military courier. Eleanor caught Swift Arrow's eye as she entered. The slight tension in his posture told her the news wasn't good. Once everyone was seated, Swift Arrow addressed the gathering. Over the past year, his command of English had improved remarkably, though he still occasionally looked to Eleanor when complex concepts required explanation. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Ryder brings important news from Fort Whipple. Major Brooks sent a warning." He gestured to the courier. "Tell them what you told me." The young soldier stepped forward nervously, clearly intimidated by the mixed audience. "Major Brooks sends his regrets that he cannot attend today's scheduled meeting. There's been a significant development that requires his immediate attention." "What development?" Samuel Tucker pressed. The courier glanced around the room before continuing. "A new territorial judge has been appointed, Judge Harlan Montgomery. He arrived at Fort Whipple 3 days ago with orders to review all arrangements made by his predecessor, particularly those involving," he hesitated, "native populations." A murmur rippled through the assembly. The previous judge had been sympathetic to the cooperative zone, formally recognizing its legal standing despite opposition from certain political quarters. "This new judge," Chief Running Elk asked, his voice steady despite the concern evident. "In his eyes, what is his reputation?" The courier shifted uncomfortably. "Judge Montgomery served previously in Dakota Territory, sir. He's known for strict interpretation of federal Indian policy." Eleanor and Swift Arrow exchanged worried glances. Strict interpretation typically meant enforcement of reservation boundaries and limitations on tribal sovereignty. Precisely the approach they had worked so hard to overcome with the cooperative zone. Mason leaned forward. "Has the judge expressed any specific intentions regarding our settlement?" "Yes, sir," the courier replied. "He's ordered a complete review of the land grants made to the cooperative zone, particularly the portion that once belonged to Thomas Blackwood. He's questioning whether the governor had authority to designate those lands without federal approval." The implications settled heavily over the gathering. Without legal protection, everything they had built could be dismantled with the stroke of a pen. "When does this judge plan to visit?" Eleanor asked. "That's the most urgent news," the courier responded. "He's on his way now. Major Brooks is escorting him personally, hoping to present the settlement in the most favorable light. They should arrive by tomorrow morning." As the meeting dissolved into concerned discussion, Eleanor slipped outside, needing a moment to process this new threat. She found herself walking toward the boundary marker, a simple stone pillar inscribed with symbols from both cultures that designated the beginning of the cooperative zone. Swift Arrow joined her moments later, his familiar presence, a comfort in the face of uncertainty. "You're worried," he observed. Eleanor nodded. "Everything we've built could be undone if this judge decides against us." Swift Arrow considered this. Papers, laws, boundaries, these are white man's weapons. We must learn to fight with them as well as we fight with bows and rifles. "But how none of us are lawyers. We don't have influence in territorial politics." "We have something stronger," Swift Arrow replied. "Truth, and many voices to speak it." Eleanor appreciated his optimism, but practical concerns weighed heavily. "Truth doesn't always prevail in courtrooms, Swift Arrow. My father says Judge Montgomery made his reputation removing tribes from valuable lands in Dakota Territory. Swift Arrow's expression hardened slightly. Then we must make him see value in keeping us here. They stood in thoughtful silence, watching as the setting sun cast long shadows across the trading post. In the year since its establishment, the settlement had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Apache families who had previously avoided all contact with settlers now brought their crafts to trade. Ranchers who once viewed the Apache with suspicion now sought their expertise in predicting weather patterns and finding water. The forge served everyone equally, producing tools that combined the best elements of both cultures' designs. More significant than the physical structures were the relationships that had formed. Friendships, business partnerships, and even several marriages between the communities. Eleanor and Swift Arrow's relationship, once the subject of whispers and speculation, was now accepted as a natural extension of the cooperation they promoted. "We need to prepare," Eleanor said finally. "If the judge arrives tomorrow, we should show him everything we've accomplished." Swift Arrow nodded. "I will speak with the elders. You talk to town leaders. And we should send riders to outlying ranches," Eleanor added. "The more supporters present, the better." By dawn the following day, the cooperative zone hummed with activity. Word of the judge's impending visit had spread rapidly, bringing allies from across the valley. Women from both communities prepared food for the expected guests, while men ensured the settlement looked its best. Children were enlisted to gather wildflowers to decorate the meeting hall, a small touch that Eleanor hoped might soften even the sternest judicial heart. Mason Sullivan oversaw preparations at the forge, ensuring every tool was in its place and fires burned at optimal levels. "If we're to impress this judge," he told the apprentices, "we'll show him the finest metalwork in the territory." Shortly before noon, sentries reported a dust cloud approaching from the direction of Fort Whipple. Eleanor, Swift Arrow, Mason, and Chief Running Elk gathered at the settlement's entrance, presenting a united front as 3 riders came into view. Major Brooks led the procession, his military bearing tempered by the genuine smile he offered as he dismounted. Behind him rode a second soldier, and a stern-faced man whose black judicial robes had been covered by a dust coat for the journey. Chief Running Elk, Mr. Sullivan, Miss Sullivan, Mr. Swift Arrow. Brooks greeted them formally. "May I present Judge Harlan Montgomery, recently appointed to oversee legal matters in our territory." Judge Montgomery dismounted with surprising agility for a man of his years. Tall and rail-thin, with penetrating grey eyes beneath bushy brows, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "So this is the famous cooperative zone," he remarked, surveying the settlement with a critical eye. "Quite different from what I expected." "In what way, Your Honor?" Eleanor asked politely. Montgomery turned his sharp gaze on her. "Young woman, I've reviewed reports describing this place as everything from a lawless frontier outpost to a model of peaceful coexistence. The truth, I suspect, lies somewhere between." "We would be honored to show you our community," Chief Running Elk offered. "Then you may judge for yourself." "Indeed I shall," Montgomery replied. "That is precisely why I've come." What followed was a carefully orchestrated tour of the settlement. The judge observed trading activities, inspected the forge's operations, and examined records of disputes that had been resolved through the Joint Council. He asked pointed questions about governance, property rights, and enforcement of agreements, making notes in a small leather book he carried. Throughout the tour, Eleanor found herself increasingly troubled by the judge's inscrutable expressions. While he seemed genuinely impressed by certain aspects of the settlement, particularly the forge's innovative techniques, he revealed little about his overall assessment. By late afternoon, the judge had seen most of the cooperative zone's operations. As the day's heat began to wane, Major Brooks suggested they conclude with a meeting in the central hall where community members awaited the opportunity to address the judge directly. Inside, the hall had been prepared to showcase the settlement at its best. Fresh boughs scented the air, and displays of crafts from both cultures lined the walls. Every available seat was filled, with standing room occupied by late arrivals from distant ranches. Judge Montgomery took the position of honor, with Major Brooks, Chief Running Elk, and Mason Sullivan flanking him. The judge surveyed the assembled crowd with an unreadable expression before speaking. "I have spent today observing your unusual arrangement," he began, his voice filling the hall without effort. "Before making any decisions about its legal status, I wish to hear from those who live and work here. Who will speak first?" For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Samuel Tucker rose from his seat. "Your Honor, I've been running the general store in Willow Creek for 15 years. Before this settlement was established, I lost merchandise twice to Apache raids and once to bandit gangs. Since the cooperative zone began, trade has flourished without a single incident of theft or violence. My profits have doubled, and so have opportunities for everyone in the valley." Montgomery nodded, making a brief note. "Economics is certainly a consideration. Who else?" One by one, settlers and Apache alike stood to share their perspectives. A rancher described how Apache knowledge of water sources had saved his cattle during a drought. A tribal elder explained how access to modern medicine had saved lives during a winter illness. A young couple, the woman, a settler's daughter, the man an Apache craftsman, presented their infant child as living proof of the possibilities that cooperation had created. Throughout these testimonies, the judge listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but offering no hint of his leanings. Finally, Eleanor stepped forward. "Your Honor, when Thomas Blackwood burned our forge and nearly killed my father, it was the Apache who saved us. They could have turned away, protecting only themselves in the conflict that followed. Instead, they chose compassion and justice." She gestured around the hall. "What we've built here isn't just about trade or security or even peaceful coexistence. It's about recognizing that different traditions can strengthen rather than threaten each other." Swift Arrow moved to stand beside her. "Judge Montgomery, my grandfather fought white settlers. My father avoided them. I work with them. Each generation must find its own wisdom." Montgomery studied them both for a long moment before rising to his feet. The hall fell silent as he prepared to speak. "In my 20 years on the bench," he began, "I have developed certain expectations about the natural order of things. Settlers settle. Natives either resist or relocate. That is the pattern I have observed across many territories." He clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. "What you have created here defies those expectations. It contradicts policies currently favored in Washington. It challenges assumptions that many, including myself, have long held about the impossibility of genuine cooperation between such different peoples." The judge paused, and Eleanor felt Swift Arrow's hand find hers, both of them bracing for the verdict. "My duty," Montgomery continued, "is to uphold the law. But laws are created by men, and men are fallible. Sometimes rigid adherence to general policy fails to serve justice in specific circumstances." He turned to face the hall. "I am not yet prepared to make a final determination regarding the legal status of this cooperative zone. Such a decision requires careful consideration of both territorial and federal statutes." Disappointment rippled through the assembly, but Montgomery raised his hand for silence. "However, I am prepared to issue a temporary judicial decree. Pending full review, the cooperative zone will maintain its current boundaries and governance structure for a period of 1 year. During this time, I will personally monitor its development and compliance with territorial law." Relief swept through the hall, though Eleanor noted the cautious expressions on older Apache faces. A temporary reprieve was not the same as permanent protection. There is one additional matter, Montgomery added, the land formerly belonging to Thomas Blackwood. Tension returned to the room. The Blackwood Ranch comprised nearly a third of the cooperative zone's territory, including valuable water access and grazing land. After reviewing documents related to Blackwood's confession and the disposition of his estate, I find the territorial governor's allocation of those lands to the cooperative zone to be within legal bounds. Montgomery's tone became firmer. That portion of my ruling is final and not subject to the one-year review period. Restrained celebration broke out among the assembly. While their future wasn't completely secured, this judgment provided substantial protection for the most contested portion of their territory. As formal proceedings concluded and the gathering transitioned to an impromptu celebration, Eleanor found a quiet moment with Swift Arrow, Mason, and Chief Running Elk. 1 year, Mason mused. Not as long as we'd hoped for, but longer than I feared we might get. Chief Running Elk nodded thoughtfully. Judge's mind is not closed. Eyes still see. This is a good sign. We need to make this year count, Eleanor said. Show him and everyone that what we've built here deserves to continue. Swift Arrow gazed across the hall, where Judge Montgomery was deep in conversation with Major Brooks. Montgomery, man of laws, but also man who listens. Rare combination. Later that evening, as festivities continued under star-filled skies, Eleanor found herself approached by the judge himself. Miss Sullivan, Montgomery said, I've been hearing quite a lot about you from Major Brooks. He seems to believe you're the heart of this entire enterprise. Eleanor flushed slightly. Many people made this possible, Your Honor. I'm just one voice among many. Perhaps, the judge replied, but from what I've observed, it's a particularly influential voice. He studied her with newfound curiosity. You chose a difficult path. Most young women in your position would have accepted Blackwood's proposal, despite his character flaws. I never wanted wealth or status, Eleanor said simply. I wanted to continue my father's work, to use the skills he taught me. And now? What do you want now? Eleanor considered the question carefully. To build something lasting, something that proves we don't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. Montgomery nodded slowly. A worthy ambition, and your relationship with the Apache warrior, Swift Arrow, does that factor into your vision? The direct question caught Eleanor off guard. Her relationship with Swift Arrow had evolved naturally, accepted by both communities but rarely discussed so openly, particularly with outsiders. Swift Arrow and I share the same hopes for this place, she answered carefully. Our personal relationship has grown from that shared purpose. I see. Montgomery's expression softened slightly. Miss Sullivan, I didn't tell the full truth earlier. Before coming here, I had already decided this experiment was likely doomed to failure, a well-intentioned but naive attempt to defy the inevitable course of progress. He gazed out at the celebration, where Apache and settlers mingled freely around campfires. What I've witnessed today has unsettled certain convictions. I make no promises about my final ruling a year from now, but I assure you, I will judge, based on what I observe, not on predetermined expectations. With that, he nodded politely and moved away, leaving Eleanor with a fragile hope. Whatever the coming year might bring, they had won the opportunity to demonstrate the value of what they'd created. In a territory where opportunities were often as scarce as rainfall, that chance was precious indeed. As the celebration continued into the night, Eleanor found Swift Arrow waiting for her near the forge, their forge, that had risen from the ashes of destruction. Judge is a difficult man to read, he remarked. Yes, Eleanor agreed, but at least he's willing to read us at all. That's more than many would offer. Swift Arrow took her hand, the gesture now familiar and comforting. 1 year to show him truth. We will use it well. Under the vast Arizona sky, with mountains silhouetted against stars, Eleanor Sullivan contemplated the strange path that had led her here. A rejected proposal, a vindictive attack, an unexpected alliance. Each turning point could have led to tragedy. Instead, through courage and compassion on both sides, something unprecedented had emerged. The future remains uncertain. Washington politics, territorial ambitions, and ancient prejudices all threatened what they had built. Yet standing beside the man who had bridged worlds with her, watching their communities celebrate their temporary victory, Eleanor felt a certainty that transcended legal rulings and official decrees. Some flames once ignited cannot be extinguished, not by violence, not by politics, not even by the weight of history itself. The Forge had taught her that transformation requires both heat and pressure. What emerged from such testing was often stronger than what had existed before. "Come," Swift Arrow said, tugging gently at her hand. "They're waiting for us." Together, they walked toward the firelight, toward the future they would forge, one day at a time. 10 months into Judge Montgomery's probationary period, the cooperative zone faced its greatest test yet. The winter had been unusually harsh, with freezing temperatures damaging crops and heavy snowfall in the mountains, making travel treacherous. Spring brought its own challenges in the form of flooding that washed out sections of the trail connecting the settlement to Willow Creek. Nature's trials, however, paled in comparison to the human obstacles that arose as news of the unusual settlement spread throughout the territory and beyond. Eleanor stood at the edge of the trading post, watching as yet another group of visitors arrived. These weren't the typical traders or curious settlers who occasionally passed through. The 5 well-dressed men, dismounting from expensive horses, carried the unmistakable air of Eastern money and influence. "Railroad men," Mason observed, joining his daughter. "Third group this month." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Swift Arrow spotted them on the North Trail yesterday, said they were surveying land all the way from Prescott." The Pacific and Arizona Railroad Company had been pushing aggressively to extend lines through the territory, promising economic prosperity to communities that welcomed their tracks and isolation to those that resisted. Their interest in the valley had been minimal until reports of the cooperative zone's success began circulating in territorial newspapers. "Mr. Sullivan," the leader of the group approached with practiced cordiality, hat in hand. "Gordon Chambers, Director of Regional Development for Pacific and Arizona. I believe we corresponded last month." "We did," Mason acknowledged coolly. "My response remains unchanged, Mr. Chambers." Chambers smiled, undeterred. "Circumstances evolve, sir. I've brought revised proposals that might address your concerns about disruption to the settlement." "Our concerns extend beyond mere disruption," Eleanor interjected. "Your proposed route would cut directly through Apache hunting grounds and sacred sites." Chambers turned to her, his expression carefully modulated to convey respectful disagreement. "Miss Sullivan, progress requires compromise. The economic benefits of railroad access would advantage all residents of this valley, including your Apache friends." Before Eleanor could respond, Swift Arrow emerged from the trading post. Over the past year, his role had evolved from informal liaison to official representative in dealings with outside entities. His clothing blended elements of both cultures, a practical adaptation that symbolized his bridging position. "Mr. Chambers," he greeted the railroad man with perfect composure. "You return quickly. Our answer has not changed." Chambers's smile tightened. "Mr. Swift Arrow, I understand your hesitation. Change can be unsettling, but I assure you, other communities across the territory are embracing the opportunities we offer. Other communities are not built on understanding between peoples. Swift Arrow replied. "Your railroad divides our land. This we cannot accept." "Perhaps we should discuss this more privately," Chambers suggested, glancing meaningfully at the growing number of onlookers. "I have maps and documents that might clarify our intentions." Mason nodded reluctantly. "The meeting hall is available. But I should warn you, our decisions are made by consensus here. Without approval from both councils, no agreement can be reached." As the men moved toward the hall, Eleanor touched Swift Arrow's arm. "Be careful," she murmured. Chambers didn't. "Bring 4 associates just for moral support." "I know," he replied quietly. "They offered money to some of our young men yesterday. Try to create division." This news sharpened Eleanor's concern. The cooperative zone's strength lay in unity, but even the strongest bonds could be tested by enough pressure or temptation. While the meeting proceeded, Eleanor returned to the forge where her apprentices waited. Lily Hawkins had developed remarkable skill over the past year and now assisted in teaching newer students. Today, they were crafting specialized tools for spring planting, incorporating designs that merged settler efficiency with Apache knowledge of local soil conditions. "Is it true the railroad wants to build through here?" Lily asked as they worked. Eleanor nodded, focusing on the metal she was shaping. "They've been increasingly persistent." "My father says it would bring more customers for everyone," Lily ventured, "and make it easier to ship goods to Prescott and beyond." "Your father isn't wrong about those benefits," Eleanor acknowledged. "But the costs would be significant too. The proposed route would disrupt migration patterns that the Apache have relied on for generations. And the construction crews." She hesitated, aware of Lily's youth. "They don't always show respect for local customs or boundaries." Lily considered this, her young face serious. "It's complicated, isn't it? Not just good or bad. Most important." "Things are," Eleanor agreed, pleased by the girl's thoughtfulness. By mid-afternoon, the meeting with Chambers had concluded without resolution. The railroad representatives departed with professionally concealed frustration, promising to return with more amenable terms. "They offered triple their initial price," Mason reported to Eleanor afterward, "and guarantees of employment for both settlers and Apache during construction." "Generous," Eleanor remarked skeptically. "What's the catch?" "The catch," Swift Arrow said, joining them, "is railroad wants answer before Judge Montgomery returns for final decision. I want to present him with a completed agreement." The strategy was clever. If the cooperative zone signed an agreement with the railroad before Montgomery's final ruling, it would create facts on the ground that would be difficult for the judge to overturn, regardless of his assessment of the settlement's overall viability. "They're trying to exploit our uncertainty," Eleanor realized, "offering immediate benefits in exchange for permanent concessions." Mason nodded gravely. "And they're not the only ones maneuvering ahead of Montgomery's return. I received a letter from the territorial governor yesterday. Apparently, several prominent businessmen in Prescott have petitioned to have our arrangement declared illegal on commercial grounds." "What commercial grounds?" Eleanor demanded. "They claim our trading practices create unfair competition because we operate outside normal territorial taxation and commerce regulations." Mason sighed heavily. "It's a flimsy argument legally, but it adds political pressure on Montgomery." As spring progressed into early summer, these external pressures began to create internal strains. At a joint council meeting in late May, the first serious fractures appeared. "The railroad brings opportunities we cannot ignore," argued Joseph Miller, a farmer whose land bordered the northern edge of the cooperative zone. "My sons need prospects beyond scratching a living from the soil." "And what of our sons?" countered Nighthawk, an Apache elder whose voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Where will they hunt when the iron horse scares away game? Where will they gather sacred plants when track cuts through medicine grounds?" The debate continued for hours, exposing divisions that had been simmering beneath the settlement's harmonious surface. Some settlers saw the railroad as inevitable progress. Others recognized the threat it posed to the delicate balance they had achieved. Among the Apache, younger members were increasingly drawn to the economic opportunities of closer integration with territorial commerce, while elders emphasized the importance of maintaining traditional lifeways. Through it all, Eleanor observed the subtle but unmistakable strain developing between Swift Arrow and her father. Though they remained aligned in opposing Chambers' proposal, their reasons and priorities differed in ways that could no longer be easily reconciled. After the meeting concluded without consensus, the first deadlock in months, Eleanor found Swift Arrow at their favorite overlook above the settlement. "The first stars are appearing," she said, settling beside him on the rocky outcropping. He nodded without speaking, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the last light of day was fading. "You're troubled," Eleanor observed after a long silence. Swift Arrow turned to her, his expression revealing the burden he carried. "I stand between worlds, Eleanor. Some days the ground beneath my feet feels solid. Today," he shook his head, "today it shifts like sand because of the division in the council. Because I see the truth on both sides," he admitted. "Young men of my people need a future beyond old ways, need skills, opportunities. But elders also speak the truth. We cannot abandon what makes us Apache." Eleanor took his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, evidence of their shared work in the forge. "Perhaps there's a path that preserves what's essential while adapting to what cannot be avoided. Perhaps," he agreed without conviction, "but railroad men do not seek a middle path. They seek only a straight line from here to there, cutting through whatever stands between." The following weeks brought no resolution to the railroad question, but did deliver a new complication. A letter arrived from Judge Montgomery, announcing his intention to return for his final assessment earlier than expected in just 3 weeks' time. He says he's received concerning reports about divisions within the settlement, Mason read from the letter during an emergency council meeting, and wants to evaluate the situation personally before making his final determination. Running Elk, whose health had deteriorated over the harsh winter, spoke with effort. "Judge comes to watch us quarrel. This serves enemies of peace." His words sobered the assembly. Despite their differences regarding the railroad, no one wanted to see the cooperative zone dissolved. Without its legal protections, the Apache would likely face forcible relocation to distant reservations, while settlers would lose the security and prosperity that partnership had brought. "We need to present a united front," Samuel Tucker suggested. "Set aside the railroad question until after Montgomery's ruling." "Chambers won't wait," Joseph Miller objected. "He's already threatening to reroute through Johnson's Canyon. That would isolate us commercially." "Better isolated than divided," Eleanor countered. "If Montgomery revokes our status, none of the railroad's promises will matter anyway." As debate swirled around practical concerns, Swift Arrow surprised everyone by standing and walking to the center of the hall. Though he regularly participated in discussions, he rarely commanded attention so deliberately. "I have listened to all voices," he began, his gaze moving slowly around the circle, "to fears of the future and defense of the past. Both have wisdom. Both have weaknesses." The hall quieted, all eyes focusing on the young leader who had become the embodiment of the settlement's bridging mission. 1 year ago, we faced Judge Montgomery together, showed him not a perfect place, but a place of possibility. Now we argue among ourselves about railroad, about progress, about tradition. Swift Arrow paused, letting his words sink in. "These are good arguments to have. They show we are alive, growing, thinking." He moved to where Running Elk sat and knelt respectfully before the aging chief. "Our elders teach us to honor what came before." Then he stood and walked to where several young Apache men had gathered. "Our youth remind us to prepare for what comes next." Finally, he turned to address the entire assembly. "Judge does not come to see perfect agreement. He comes to see if we can disagree without destroying what we build together." Eleanor felt a surge of pride, watching Swift Arrow transform tension into contemplation. In that moment, she glimpsed not just the man she had grown to love, but the leader he was becoming. "Swift Arrow speaks wisdom," Running Elk affirmed. "We must show Montgomery not the absence of conflict, but a better way to resolve it." Gradually, the council meeting shifted from divisive positioning to productive planning. While fundamental disagreements about the railroad remained, all parties committed to demonstrating the settlement's continued viability during Montgomery's visit. 3 weeks passed quickly. The cooperative zone prepared for the judge's inspection with nervous energy but growing solidarity. Even those who favored the railroad recognized the paramount importance of securing their legal status first. When Judge Montgomery arrived, accompanied once again by Major Brooks, he found not a fractured community, but one engaged in honest wrestling with complex questions about its future. During his 4-day assessment, he observed council deliberations, interviewed residents from both cultures, and reviewed records of disputes that had been successfully resolved through the settlement's unique governance structure. On his final evening, Montgomery requested a private meeting with those who had first welcomed him to the settlement a year earlier: Mason Sullivan, Eleanor, Swift Arrow, and Chief Running Elk. They gathered in the small chamber adjoining the main hall, tension evident. Despite their efforts at composure, Montgomery settled into the chair provided, arranging his notes methodically before speaking. "When I departed last year, I harbored significant doubts about this experiment's sustainability. I granted the probationary period more from judicial caution than genuine optimism." He looked up, his keen eyes moving from face to face. "I return to find a settlement facing genuine challenges, external pressures, internal disagreements, difficult decisions about the future. In other words, I find a real community rather than an idealistic fantasy." Eleanor exchanged a hopeful glance with Swift Arrow. Montgomery's tone suggested approval rather than disappointment in their imperfections. "The question before me," the judge continued, "is whether this cooperative zone merits continued legal recognition despite its unconventional nature. After careful consideration of territorial statutes, federal Indian policy, and the practical realities I have observed, I am prepared to render my decision." He paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the room. "It is my judgment that the cooperative zone shall maintain its current legal status indefinitely, subject to annual review by territorial authorities, but protected from arbitrary dissolution." Relief flooded through Eleanor, so profound she momentarily felt lightheaded. Beside her, Mason released an audible breath, while Running Elk closed his eyes in silent thanksgiving. Swift Arrow remained completely still, as if fearing any movement might break the fragile moment. "There are, however, conditions," Montgomery added. "First, the settlement must maintain its demonstrated commitment to equal justice for all residents, regardless of origin. Second, it must continue to resolve internal disputes through the established council system rather than defaulting to either territorial courts or tribal judgments." He fixed Swift Arrow with a particularly intent look. "And third, decisions regarding significant matters affecting the entire settlement, such as the railroad proposal currently under consideration, must represent genuine consensus rather than merely the will of the most powerful voices." "These terms are acceptable," Running Elk said with quiet dignity. "They reflect what we already believe." Montgomery nodded, apparently satisfied. "Then there is one final matter to address." He reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document. "This arrived from Washington shortly before my departure from Fort Whipple. It is a formal inquiry from the Bureau of Indian Affairs regarding the status of Apache residents here." The atmosphere in the room instantly tensified. The Bureau was notorious for its rigid enforcement of reservation policies and general hostility toward innovative arrangements like the cooperative zone. The Bureau has limited direct authority in territories, Montgomery continued, but substantial influence with Congress and the War Department. They could make things very difficult should they choose to intervene. What do they want? Mason asked bluntly. Information, officially. Montgomery's expression suggested skepticism about the Bureau's stated intentions. They wish to send representatives to evaluate whether this settlement constitutes an appropriate alternative to reservation placement. Swift Arrow leaned forward. And unofficially, Montgomery's mouth twitched in what might have been admiration for the young man's perception. Unofficially, I suspect they seek justification for terminating this arrangement. The success of your cooperative zone raises uncomfortable questions about their broader reservation policy. Eleanor felt her hard-won relief beginning to erode. When will they come? That remains unspecified. Montgomery returned the document to his coat. But I would advise preparation rather than anxiety. The Bureau moves with bureaucratic sluggishness, which gives you time to strengthen your position. How? Swift Arrow asked. Montgomery rose, indicating the meeting was concluding. By demonstrating what I have witnessed here, that different peoples can maintain their distinct identities while creating something valuable together. The Bureau expects failure because their policy is predicated on the impossibility of meaningful cooperation. He moved toward the door, then paused. One last observation, if I may. Your greatest strength lies not in your forge or your trading post or even your governance structure, impressive as those achievements are. It lies in the relationships you've formed across boundaries that most consider impermeable. His gaze settled briefly on Eleanor and Swift Arrow standing side by side. Those connections will ultimately prove more durable than any legal ruling I could issue. After the judge's departure the following morning, the settlement absorbed the mixed news of his decision. Permanent legal recognition balanced against the looming threat from Washington. The question of the railroad remained unresolved, now complicated by the need to present a united front to future Bureau investigators. As summer heat intensified, Eleanor and Swift Arrow found rare solitude near the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the settlement. Cottonwood trees provided welcome shade as they discussed the community's uncertain future. One challenge ends, another begins, Swift Arrow observed, skimming a stone across the water's surface, like seasons changing. Eleanor nodded, leaning against his shoulder. At least Montgomery gave us firmer ground to stand on. Whatever comes, next we face it with legal recognition. Swift Arrow turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. Eleanor Sullivan, I have a question that cannot wait for the next challenge to pass. Something in his tone caused her heart to quicken. What question? From a small pouch at his waist, Swift Arrow withdrew an object that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves above, a band of silver inlaid with turquoise and tiny copper accents. In my tradition, men offer women special gifts. To show serious intention, he explained. In your tradition, men offer rings and ask women to join lives together. He held the band between them. These are both traditions together, like us. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized the craftsmanship. Apache silverwork techniques combined with designs she had taught him in the forge. Eleanor Sullivan, Blacksmith's daughter, woman of fire and iron. Swift Arrow continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. Will you join your path with mine? Not just in work we do for others, but in life we build together. For a moment, Eleanor thought of Thomas Blackwood's diamond, cold, impressive, demanding. How different this handcrafted band felt, warm with meaning and possibility, rather than Possession. Yes, she answered, her voice clear and certain. Yes, I will join my path with yours, Swift Arrow, man of two worlds and one heart. As he slipped the band onto her finger, a perfect fit, as she would expect from a man who had learned precision at her side in the forge, Eleanor realized they were creating yet another bridge. Their union would exemplify the very connections Judge Montgomery had recognized as the settlement's greatest strength. Whatever challenges awaited, from railroad interests, from Washington bureaucrats, from the inevitable friction of cultures in contact, they would face them not just as allies in a shared cause, but as partners in a shared life. The silver band caught the sunlight as Eleanor extended her hand to admire it. Like the metal itself, their future would require both strength and flexibility, resistance to corrosion, yet willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. "It's perfect," she told him, and meant far more than just the ring. Together they walked back toward the settlement, their settlement, where smoke rose from the forge that had once been ashes, where children of both cultures played together, in the dusty street, where elders shared wisdom across ancient divides. The blacksmith's daughter, who had refused a wealthy suitor's diamond, had found something far more precious in the aftermath of destruction. Not just a home rebuilt or justice served, but a future forged from the most resistant materials of all: courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that different metals, when properly joined, create something stronger than either could. Be alone. 5 years had passed since Judge Montgomery granted the cooperative zone permanent legal status. The settlement had grown beyond what anyone could have imagined, becoming a unique fixture in the Arizona Territory landscape. What had begun as a desperate alliance in the aftermath of violence had matured into a thriving community that attracted visitors from as far away as Boston and San Francisco. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Eleanor worked at the expanded forge, now a sprawling complex that employed 15 workers, a mix of settler and Apache craftspeople, whose collaborative techniques had earned regional renown. Her hands, strong and sure, guided a young apprentice through the delicate process of inlaying silver wire into an iron blade. "Gentle pressure," she instructed. "Too much force, and the metal resists. Too little, and the bond fails." At 28, Eleanor Sullivan Arrow had grown into her role not just as master blacksmith, but as one of the settlement's most respected leaders. Marriage to Swift Arrow 4 years earlier had formalized a partnership that had already been central to the community's identity, and their 3-year-old daughter Margaret, named for Eleanor's mother, toddled about the workshop under the watchful eye of White Dove, now stopped with age, but still sharp of mind. "Mama, look!" The child held up a small piece of copper she had polished to a bright gleam. Eleanor smiled. "Beautiful work, little one. You have your father's patience." "And her mother's determination," added Mason Sullivan, entering the forge with a bundle of papers under his arm. At 62, the elder blacksmith had largely retired from physical labor, focusing instead on teaching and administration. The injury from Blackwood's attack had left him with occasional headaches and a slight limp, but his mind remained keen. "The Bureau representatives are arriving tomorrow," he announced, setting the papers on a workbench. "Just received word from Fort Whipple." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised but concerned. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had finally mobilized the investigation. Judge Montgomery had warned about years earlier. Political winds in Washington had shifted, bringing renewed emphasis on consolidating tribes onto established reservations. The cooperative zone's independent arrangement had become increasingly problematic for federal policymakers seeking uniformity in Indian affairs. "Swift Arrow is meeting with the council now," Mason continued. "They're reviewing all our documentation, land, grants, dispute resolutions, trade records, and the railroad agreement," Eleanor asked, referencing the compromise that had eventually been reached after months of negotiation. The Pacific and Arizona Railroad had been permitted to build a spur line to the settlement, but not through the sacred hunting grounds that had been the original point of contention. "That's our strongest evidence," Mason confirmed. "Proof that we can navigate complex challenges through consensus rather than coercion." Eleanor finished the demonstration for her apprentice before untying her leather apron. "I should join the council meeting. Anna, please continue practicing the inlay technique. I'll review your work this afternoon." After cleaning her hands and checking on Margaret, who was happily learning to weave a small basket under White Dove's guidance, Eleanor made her way to the council hall. The building had been expanded twice over the years to accommodate the settlement's growth, its design evolving to incorporate architectural elements from both cultures, high, arched windows that admitted desert light while deflecting heat, support beams carved with intertwined symbols, walls of adobe that maintained comfortable temperatures year-round. Inside, she found Swift Arrow addressing the joint council. At 30, her husband had matured into the leader Running Elk had envisioned, his natural diplomatic abilities honed by years of navigating between worlds. The aging chief had formally transferred leadership responsibilities to Swift Arrow II, winters earlier, shortly before passing into the spirit world during a harsh February storm. "Bureau men come not just to observe, but to judge," Swift Arrow was explaining as Eleanor quietly took her seat. "They seek reasons to end what we have built. We must show them not just successful trading posts or forge, but successful people, living in a better way." Samuel Tucker, now white-haired, but still serving as the settlers' lead representative, nodded in agreement. "The economic arguments are solidly in our favor. Since the cooperative zone's establishment, regional trade has increased threefold. Even Prescott merchants who initially opposed us now benefit from our supply chains. Economic success is not enough," Swift Arrow cautioned. "The Bureau cares about controlling Apache people, not helping them prosper. They will look for signs of discord, of Apache becoming too independent in their eyes." Eleanor recognized the burden her husband carried. For Swift Arrow, the coming inspection represented not just a bureaucratic hurdle, but an existential threat to his people's hard-won autonomy. When the meeting adjourned, she joined him as he walked toward the stream that marked the settlement's eastern boundary. This had become their place of retreat when difficult decisions loomed, a quiet spot where water-polished stones and the gentle rustle of cottonwood leaves provided perspective beyond the day's pressing concerns. "You're worried," she observed as they settled on the familiar granite outcropping overlooking the water. Swift Arrow gazed downstream, where several Apache children were learning to fish using traditional methods alongside settler children being taught the same techniques. 5 years ago, that sight would have been impossible," he said, nodding toward the scene. "Now it is everyday life." "Then why the concern? We've proven what Judge Montgomery asked us to demonstrate, that cooperation benefits everyone." Swift Arrow picked up a small stone, turning it over in his fingers. "Washington bureaucrats see differently than frontier judges. They create policies for the entire nation, not individual communities. Our success threatens their system." Eleanor understood his analysis, but refused to surrender to pessimism. "Then we'll make them see the human reality behind their abstractions. Show them the faces and stories of people whose lives have improved because of what we've built." "Perhaps," Swift Arrow conceded, though doubt lingered in his voice. He cast the stone into the stream, watching ripples expand outward. "Eleanor, if Bureau forces change, if they demand Apache people move to reservation, we'll face that together," she interrupted firmly. "All of us. This community doesn't exist on paper to be dismissed by officials who've never set foot here." Her certainty seemed to steady him. Swift Arrow took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, a gesture that had come to symbolize their shared approach to challenges. "Together," he agreed. like metals in forge. The Bureau representatives arrived the following day. 3 stern-faced men in city clothes that immediately set them apart from the settlement's residents. Their leader, Albert Clanton, was a career bureaucrat whose 20 years with the Bureau had left him with a rigid adherence to policy and little patience for exceptions. "This inspection will be thorough," he announced after perfunctory introductions. "We require access to all records, buildings, and residents. Our mandate from Washington is to evaluate whether this arrangement conforms to federal Indian policy guidelines." Eleanor, standing beside Swift Arrow and Mason as they welcomed the officials, noted the careful phrasing. The Bureau wasn't assessing whether the cooperative zone was successful, only whether it complied with predetermined guidelines. "We welcome your evaluation," Swift Arrow replied evenly. "Our community opens doors to honest questions." Clanton's thin lips tightened at the subtle emphasis on honest, but he maintained professional composure. "We'll begin with a tour of the settlement, followed by inspection of governance records." What followed was 3 days of meticulous examination. The Bureau men observed council proceedings, interviewed residents from both communities, inspected the forge, trading post, and newly established school. They paid particular attention to economic arrangements, property rights, and enforcement mechanisms. Throughout the inspection, Eleanor observed Clanton's barely concealed disapproval. Despite evidence of prosperity and harmony, the official seemed determined to find fault. When questioning Apache residents, he repeatedly emphasized language about government protections and reservation benefits that might be available if they relocated. On the 3rd evening, as the settlement prepared for a harvest celebration that had been planned before the Bureau visit, Eleanor overheard a troubling conversation while gathering supplies from the trading post storeroom. "This whole arrangement violates fundamental principles of the reservation system," Clanton was saying to his colleagues in the adjacent office, apparently unaware that his voice carried. "Apache tribes must be properly administered under federal supervision, not left to create independent enclaves." "But the results here are impressive," objected one of the younger officials. "Agricultural output, craft production, educational initiatives, all exceeding territorial averages." "Results are irrelevant when procedure is compromised," Clanton replied sharply. "Our report must recommend immediate dissolution of this zone and relocation of all Apache residents to the San Carlos Reservation." Eleanor froze, the implications washing over her. After years of building and maintaining their community, after overcoming violence, prejudice, and countless challenges, their fate might still be determined by an official who valued bureaucratic uniformity over human reality. She completed her errand without revealing she had overheard, but immediately sought out Swift Arrow to share this distressing information. They retreated to the privacy of their home, a spacious dwelling that harmoniously incorporated elements from both their traditions. "We suspected this might be their position," Swift Arrow said after absorbing the news. "Clanton never wanted to see our success, only our differences." "What can we do?" Eleanor asked, lowering her voice as Margaret slept in the adjoining room. "They'll submit their report within days." Swift Arrow paced the room, considering options. "We need to show Clanton something his papers and policies cannot capture, something that speaks to the heart, not just the mind. The harvest celebration." "Tonight," Eleanor suggested, an idea forming. "It's not just a social gathering, it's living proof of what we've accomplished." Swift Arrow's expression brightened. "Yes, stories told by people themselves, not filtered through officials. Clanton must hear voices his report would silence." They worked quickly, spreading word throughout the settlement. By sunset, as fires were lit and tables arranged in the central plaza, residents understood their celebration had taken on additional significance. This would be not just a harvest festival, but a demonstration of their community's soul. As twilight deepened, the Bureau officials joined the gathering, Clanton maintaining professional distance while his colleagues showed more genuine interest. Food prepared according to both Apache traditions and settler recipes filled long tables. Children performed songs learned in the settlement school, lyrics seamlessly blending both languages, crafts displaying the distinctive merged techniques that had become the settlement's trademark were exhibited with quiet pride. After the meal, as stars appeared overhead, Swift Arrow rose to address the gathering. Eleanor, watching from nearby, noted the subtle straightening of his posture, the transition from husband and father to leader. "Friends, neighbors, honored guests," he began, his voice carrying easily across the hushed plaza. "Tonight we celebrate. More than a good harvest. We celebrated our journey and walked together." He gestured toward the older Apache members. "Some here remember days of war, of fear, remember when a bullet was more common than a handshake between our peoples." Then to the settler families. "Others remember the struggle of frontier life, uncertainty each season brought." Swift Arrow moved to where Clanton sat observing, with poorly concealed impatience. "Official visitors from Washington seek to understand our community. Maybe papers and maps tell part of the story, but true meaning lives in people, in what we build together." He extended his hand toward Eleanor, who joined him before the gathering. "My wife and I stand before you as a living bridge between worlds that once stood apart. Our daughter sleeps nearby, dreaming dreams that would have been impossible before. This place existed." Eleanor took up the narrative, her clear voice resonating with conviction born from lived experience. "When Thomas Blackwood burned my father's forge and threatened our lives, it was the Apache who offered shelter and healing. From that act of compassion grew understanding, then cooperation, then genuine community. One by one, others rose to share their stories." Samuel Tucker described how Apache medicinal knowledge had saved his wife during a fever that conventional doctors couldn't treat. Young Apache warriors told of skills learned in the forge that allowed them to provide for their families in new ways while maintaining traditional practices. Lily Hawkins, now a young woman of 21 and the settlement's first female apprentice blacksmith after Eleanor, spoke of opportunities that would have been impossible in conventional settler towns. Throughout these testimonials, Eleanor observed Clanton's expression gradually shifting, not to wholesale acceptance, but to reluctant recognition that he faced something more complex than his policy manuals addressed. As the evening progressed, Mason Sullivan rose with assistance from a carved walking stick Swift Arrow had made for him. The elder blacksmith's voice, though softer with age, still commanded attention. "I've lived 70 years, he began, "and seen more changes than most. Wars, peace treaties, territories becoming states. But nothing in my life has taught me more about human possibility than this settlement." Mason turned directly to Clanton. "Sir, you came to evaluate us according to guidelines written by men who've never set foot here. I respect your duty, but I ask you to consider that sometimes the map requires revision when the terrain proves more promising than expected." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering. Even Clanton's colleagues nodded subtly, moved by the sincere testimony they had witnessed. When the formal presentations concluded, the celebration continued with music and dancing. Eleanor noticed Clanton standing apart, observing the natural interaction of people who had once been bitter enemies, but now moved through life as an integrated community. "Your stories are compelling," he acknowledged when she approached. "But my responsibility is to federal Indian policy, not individual circumstances, however exceptional." "I understand," Eleanor replied. "But policy exists to serve people, Mr. Clanton, not the reverse. Surely Washington would want to know when an approach succeeds beyond expectation." "Success by whose definition?" he challenged, though with less certainty than before. By the most fundamental measure, human flourishing, she answered simply. Look around you. Apache children learn to read while maintaining their cultural traditions. Settler families incorporate indigenous knowledge that helps them thrive in this harsh landscape. Trade relationships that benefit the entire territory. Clanton's gaze moved across the celebration, lingering on a group where Apache elders were teaching settler children traditional dances, their weathered faces alight with the pleasure of transmission rather than loss. I've served the Bureau through 3 administrations, he said finally, seen policies come and go. The current direction strongly favors centralized reservation management. And yet exceptions exist, Eleanor pressed. Special cases recognized because they work. Clanton offered no further comment, but his thoughtful expression suggested internal reconsideration of his predetermined conclusion. The Bureau representatives departed the following day. Their formal report would not reach the settlement for several months, leaving the community in uncertain anticipation. Life continued. Forge fires burned, council meetings addressed daily concerns, children studied and played. The railroad spur brought goods and visitors, crops were tended. Through it all, Eleanor observed a subtle but significant shift in the settlement's collective spirit. The Bureau inspection, rather than weakening their resolve, had strengthened their appreciation for what they had built together. In articulating their community's value to outsiders, they had renewed their own commitment to its preservation. 4 months later, an official letter arrived from Washington. The settlement gathered in the council hall as Swift Arrow broke the seal and began to read aloud. After thorough investigation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs acknowledges the cooperative zone of Willow Creek as a special administrative designation within federal Indian policy. While not conforming to standard reservation protocols, this settlement demonstrates exceptional outcomes that merit continued observation rather than dissolution. Relief and celebration erupted throughout the hall. The bureaucratic language concealed a remarkable victory, recognition that their community deserved to exist on its own terms, rather than being forced into predetermined categories. Later that evening, as the settlement celebrated this latest validation of their experiment, Eleanor and Swift Arrow returned to their special place by the stream. The setting sun painted the water with golden light as they sat in companionable silence, absorbing the significance of the day's news. "We won a reprieve, not permanent security," Swift Arrow noted eventually, ever the pragmatist. "Other challenges will come," Eleanor nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "They always do, but each one makes us stronger, more certain of our path." Swift Arrow's arm encircled her waist as they watched the sunset colors deepen. "When Blackwood burned your home, he thought he destroyed your world. Instead, he made it larger." Eleanor completed the thought, a truth they had come to recognize over the years. Sometimes destruction clears space for creation. As darkness gathered around them, the distant sounds of celebration drifted from the settlement, their home, their creation, their legacy. What had begun in violence had transformed through courage and vision into something neither culture could have built alone. The blacksmith's daughter who refused a diamond had instead helped forge something far more precious, a community that stood as living proof that even the most entrenched divisions could be overcome when people recognized humanity in one another. It wasn't perfect, wasn't without struggle, but in its imperfect striving lay its most powerful truth. Eleanor took Swift Arrow's hand as they rose to rejoin the celebration. Together they walked toward the lights of home, 2 people from different worlds who had discovered that the strongest metals are those formed from diverse elements, carefully combined and tempered by both fire and time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.